I lost the bet. I knew I shouldn't have taken it, but pride can be a dangerous thing. My friends and I had been drinking, and one thing led to another. The old abandoned hospital at the edge of town came up in conversation, and before I knew it, I was agreeing to spend the night there. Alone. Everyone in town had heard the stories. The place had been closed for decades, but rumors swirled about what had happened there before it shut down. Some said it had been a psychiatric hospital, others claimed there had been a fire, and others talked about a doctor who did unspeakable things to the patients. Whatever the truth was, the building stood there, crumbling and forgotten, its windows dark and its halls empty. Or so people said. The bet was simple. I had to stay the entire night, from dusk until dawn. If I made it, I'd win enough money to make the discomfort worth it. If I chickened out or left early, I'd never live it down. My friends would drive me to the hospital, drop me off with a flashlight and a sleeping bag, and pick me up in the morning. Easy, right? When we arrived, the hospital loomed over us like a rotting corpse. Its windows were shattered, and ivy had crept up the sides of the building, swallowing it whole. The front entrance was barely intact, the doors hanging off their hinges. The air around it felt wrong, thick and oppressive, as though the building itself didn't want me there. I played it cool, of course, even as a cold pit of dread formed in my stomach. My friends cracked jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but their laughter felt forced, nervous. They gave me a flashlight, a half-hearted good luck, and then sped off into the night, leaving me standing alone in front of the decaying hospital. I swallowed hard and stepped through the broken front doors. The air inside was damp and smelled of mold, the darkness thick and absolute. My flashlight cast a narrow beam of light that barely pierced the gloom. The long, empty corridors stretched out in every direction, lined with rusting gurneys, broken furniture, and peeling walls. The silence was complete, almost too complete. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the cold, cracked tiles. I made my way to what used to be the reception area, figuring it would be as good a place as any to set up for the night. The counter was covered in dust, and old papers lay scattered across the floor. I rolled out my sleeping bag behind the desk, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. As I sat down, I told myself it was just nerves. It was an old, empty building. Of course, it felt creepy. The wind howled through the broken windows, causing the remaining shards of glass to rattle and shake. I could handle this. Hours passed. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I tried to relax, but every creak, every groan from the building set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking I could hear footsteps, faint and distant, but when I listened closer, it was always gone. It had to be the wind, I told myself. Nothing more. Then came the sound of a door creaking open. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter, pointing it toward the hallway leading deeper into the hospital. The beam wavered, casting a faint glow that barely reached the corner where the noise had come from. I stood up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. "Hello," I called, my voice shaky and hoarse. No response. I took a step forward, then another, my flashlight beam flicking back and forth as I strained to see anything. The door was open now, one that had been closed earlier when I walked by. I was sure of it. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down into the basement. My pulse quickened. There was no way I was going down there, no matter what. But as I backed away, something cold brushed against my arm. I swung the flashlight around, expecting to see someone, something, but there was nothing. Just the dim light reflecting off the decayed walls. My breath came in short gasps as I stepped back toward the reception desk. The door to the basement stood open, as though it was inviting me in. I wanted to leave, to run out of the hospital and never look back, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind kept telling me to go, but my body was rooted to the spot. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled sound coming from below. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but not quite. It was more like a sob, the sound of someone crying. Against every instinct, I found myself walking toward the basement stairs. I didn't want to go down there. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to know. I had to find out who or what was making that noise. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air grew colder, and the smell of mold and decay was stronger here, thick in the air. My flashlight flickered again, its beam weakening, casting only a faint glow on the walls. The sobbing grew louder as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound echoing in the narrow, damp corridor. The basement was a maze of old storage rooms, their doors hanging open, the contents long forgotten. I followed the sound, my heart pounding louder with every step. The sobbing seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, closing in. I turned a corner and stopped. There, in the middle of the corridor, was a figure. A woman, dressed in a faded hospital gown, her back turned to me. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed softly, her hands covering her face. I didn't know what to do. My mouth went dry and I couldn't speak. I just stood there, the flashlight beam wavering as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Are you okay? I finally managed to choke out. The woman stopped sobbing. She stood still, her back still turned to me, and for a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, she began to turn. I don't know what I expected to see, but it wasn't this. Her face, it wasn't a face at all. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over her skull, and her eyes were hollow, empty sockets. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, and her hands were covered in blood. I stumbled back, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through water. She started to move toward me, her feet dragging across the floor, her mouth opening and closing silently as she reached out for me. I turned and ran. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the basement into darkness, but I didn't care. I ran blindly, stumbling over debris, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sobbing returned, louder now, surrounding me, coming from everywhere at once. I reached the stairs, scrambling up them on my hands and knees, desperate to get out. But when I reached the top, the door was closed. I slammed my fists against it, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The sobbing grew louder, closer. I could hear her coming up the stairs behind me, dragging herself toward me. My hands fumbled with the door, clawing at the handle, but it was useless. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of her breathing, right behind me. My first day as a nurse should have been exciting. After years of studying, training, and dreaming of this moment, I was ready to dive into my new career. But when I arrived at St. Alara's hospital, something felt off right away. The hospital itself was old. Too old, really. The building had been around for more than a century, and despite efforts to modernize it, the wear and tear was apparent. The walls were faded and chipped, the lights dim, and the smell, a mix of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and sour, hung in the air. It wasn't the bright, bustling place I had imagined working in. The hallways seemed quieter than they should be for a hospital. I met my supervisor, Nurse Thompson, who gave me a quick tour. She moved through the halls swiftly, not saying much, and I struggled to keep up. There was a brief introduction to the floor I'd be working on, Ward 6. It housed mostly long-term patients, some of them comatose, others in need of constant care. I was excited to finally put my training to use, but there was a heaviness here that I couldn't explain. "This is where you'll be for now," Nurse Thompson said, stopping in front of an old wooden door. "Most of the patients here are stable, but we'll ease you into things." She handed me a clipboard with the night's schedule. I nodded, trying to mask my nervousness. As she walked away, I stood alone in the dim hallway, staring at the door. The old brass numbers, 6, gleamed dully under the flickering lights. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The ward was large but eerily quiet, lined with hospital beds arranged in 2 neat rows. The windows were covered by heavy curtains, and the air felt cold despite the warmth outside. The patients, all 6 of them, lay motionless in their beds, hooked up to various machines that beeped softly. They seemed peaceful, but the whole room had an odd stillness to it, like the kind you'd expect in an abandoned building. I went through my tasks, checking charts, making rounds, and getting familiar with the patients. Most were unresponsive, their eyes closed, breathing shallow. But there was one patient, near the back of the room, who was different. Her chart labeled her as Patient 13, though her name was Jessica. According to the notes, she'd been admitted over a decade ago and had been in a persistent vegetative state ever since. She was young, probably in her early 20s when she had been brought in, though time had clearly aged her. Her body was frail, skin almost translucent, her chest rising and falling slowly under the weight of machines that seemed to keep her anchored to life. As I adjusted her IV drip, I felt a prickle of unease. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Most patients in her condition had their eyes closed, or if they were open, they weren't aware. But something about her gaze made my skin crawl. It felt like she was looking right through me. I moved away, feeling unsettled, and returned to my rounds. Hours passed, and the hospital grew even quieter. Nurse Thompson had left me alone on the ward for the night shift, and aside from the occasional faint beep from the machines, there was nothing but silence. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to patient 13, Jessica. Every time I walked by her bed, I felt that same sense of unease. Her eyes were still open, but now they seemed to follow me. It was impossible, I knew that, but the feeling was there, a weight in the room pressing down on me. Around midnight, I sat down at the nurse's station, flipping through the charts when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like the rustling of sheets. I froze, listening. It came again, a faint creaking like someone shifting in their bed. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked toward the beds. The sound had come from the back of the room, Jessica's bed. I approached slowly, my footsteps almost silent on the cold floor. She was still there, lying in her bed, her body still as ever. But her eyes, they were different now. They weren't just staring blankly, they were focused, on me. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I told myself it was just nerves, that it was impossible for her to be watching me. But her eyes followed me again as I moved. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Something was wrong. Then I heard another sound. This time, it wasn't soft. It was a rasping, whispery noise, like someone trying to speak but unable to form words. My stomach dropped. The sound was coming from Jessica. I stepped closer, leaning in, trying to hear. Her lips weren't moving, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more urgent. My throat tightened as I strained to make sense of it, but I couldn't. It wasn't words, it was just noise, a low, scratchy hiss that seemed to rise from deep in her throat. Suddenly, one of the machines next to her bed let out a shrill beep. I jumped back, nearly tripping over myself as the noise cut through the room. The heart monitor was spiking, her pulse racing. I fumbled with the controls, trying to reset it, but the beeping only grew more frantic. Jessica's eyes locked onto mine, her chest heaving, and for the briefest second, I swore her mouth twitched, like she was trying to smile. The hiss turned into a guttural noise, deep and unsettling, echoing in the room. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off her. The beeping reached a fever pitch, and then without warning, everything stopped. The machines went silent, the room plunging into an unbearable stillness. Jessica's eyes slowly rolled back into her head, her body slackening. I stood frozen, my heart hammering, waiting for something to happen, for someone to burst through the door. But nothing did. No nurses, no doctors, just silence. I stumbled back to the nurse's station, grabbing the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. I pressed the button again and again, but the silence on the other end remained. I turned around, ready to leave, to find someone, anyone, when I heard it again, another whisper. But this time, it wasn't coming from Jessica. It was coming from the other patients. Their beds were lined up perfectly, and I could see them from where I stood. All of them. All motionless, still hooked up to their machines, but now their mouths were moving, every single one of them. The whispering grew louder, overlapping, filling the air with a sound that wasn't quite human. My skin prickled with dread as I realized what was happening. Their eyes, like Jessica's, were no longer closed. They were open, wide, and staring, all of them looking straight at me. I backed toward the door, my entire body trembling. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, growing more frantic, more desperate. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. Something in the room with me. A shadow, not quite human, looming behind the row of beds. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its shape shifting, unnatural. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran. I slammed through the door and into the hallway, my breath ragged as I sprinted through the empty corridors of the hospital. The whispers followed me, echoing down the hall, growing louder as I ran. The lights flickered again, and with every pulse of darkness, I felt it getting closer. When I finally burst out of the hospital, the night was cold and silent. I collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. I never went back to St. Alara's. The whispers, the empty stares, the feeling of something unseen watching from the shadows, I couldn't shake it. And I knew, deep down, that I had escaped something I wasn't supposed to understand. But even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear them, the whispers. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was the sterile smell of antiseptic and the cold, hard sheets beneath me. I was in a hospital room. The walls were a dull shade of white, the fluorescent lights above humming faintly, casting an unsettling pale glow. My head pounded, and my limbs felt heavy, like I hadn't moved in days. I didn't remember how I got here. The last thing I could recall was walking home from work. Then, nothing. My throat felt dry, and when I tried to sit up, my muscles protested with sharp pain. Slowly, I managed to swing my legs over the side of the bed, and that's when I noticed something strange. The room was silent. No nurses bustling about, no beeping of machines, no distant murmur of voices. The hospital felt wrong. I called out, "Hello." My voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. There was no response. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I stood up, my legs shaky, and shuffled toward the door. The hallway outside was long and dimly lit, stretching in both directions. I peered down the corridor, but it was completely empty. The lights flickered occasionally, casting odd shadows on the walls. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was unnerving. I needed answers, and I needed to find someone, anyone. I stepped into the hallway, the sound of my bare feet echoing off the cold, tiled floor. I walked past room after room, each door slightly ajar. I hesitated at the first one, pushing it open gently. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the machines turned off. It was as if no one had ever been there. I checked the next room, then the one after that. Every room was the same, empty, sterile, abandoned. My heart began to race, my breath shallow. Something was very wrong. Hospitals aren't empty. Where was everyone? As I walked further down the hall, I noticed something unsettling. On the floor, faint but unmistakable, were wet footprints. They trailed off down the corridor, disappearing into the distance. They weren't mine. They were much larger and spaced out, as if someone had been walking briskly or even running. My throat tightened with a mixture of fear and confusion. I followed the trail, my footsteps silent against the eerie quiet. The corridor twisted and turned, and the deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The lights flickered more frequently, casting everything in harsh, unsettling flashes. I kept expecting anyone to appear, but the hospital remained a tomb of silence. At the end of the hallway, I found a set of double doors with a sign above them, Intensive Care Unit. The wet footprints led inside. The doors were slightly ajar, and as I approached, a cold draft seeped through the gap. I hesitated, but something in me, curiosity, desperation, fear, pushed me forward. I nudged the doors open and stepped through. The ICU was darker than the rest of the hospital, the lights flickering more sporadically, leaving long stretches of shadow between brief bursts of light. Rows of beds lined the room, and for the first time, I saw people, or what was left of them. The beds were occupied, but the figures lying in them were unnaturally still. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and tubes hung loosely from their bodies, attached to machines that had long since been turned off. I walked between the beds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Some of the patients had their eyes open, staring blankly at the ceiling, their mouths slightly agape. They looked like they had been dead for a while, but the room smelled faintly of antiseptic rather than decay. As I reached the far end of the room, I heard it, faint at first, then louder, a low, rasping breath. It was coming from the last bed. My pulse quickened as I approached. Unlike the others, this patient was moving, albeit slightly. Their chest rose and fell in uneven gasps, the sound ragged and unnatural. The figure was covered with a thin white sheet, and I could only make out their outline beneath it. I didn't want to get closer, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to see. I needed to understand. I slowly pulled the sheet down, revealing a face that made my blood turn to ice. It was me. The figure lying in the bed had my face, pale, gaunt, eyes half open. I staggered back, my mind spinning. How was this possible? I was standing right here, wasn't I? The figure on the bed blinked, and its lips moved, trying to form words. I leaned in, my heart pounding in my ears, and I heard it whisper, "Get out." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lights above flickered violently now, casting the room in strobe-like flashes of white and shadow. The other patients, those lifeless figures in the beds, were moving too. Slowly, they turned their heads toward me, their blank, dead eyes following me as I backed away toward the door. I turned and ran. The corridor was different now. The walls seemed to pulse, narrowing and stretching, the lights overhead flickering madly. The wet footprints were gone, replaced by a smear of something darker, something that glistened wetly in the dim light. The hospital felt alive, like it was watching me, closing in on me. Every door I passed was closed now, and behind them, I could hear faint scratching, as though something or someone was trying to get out. I didn't stop running until I reached the elevator at the end of the hall. I slammed the button repeatedly, willing the doors to open. The scratching noises grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear faint whispers, voices coming from all around me. The elevator doors slid open with a creak, and I threw myself inside, hitting the button for the lobby. The doors closed slowly, agonizingly slow, and just as they shut, I saw something in the distance. A figure standing at the far end of the corridor, watching me. The elevator shuddered and groaned as it descended. The flickering lights above me made it feel like I was trapped in a nightmare, and maybe I was. The ride down seemed to last forever, and I half expected the elevator to stop, to trap me there in the dark, but eventually the doors slid open. The lobby was dark, empty, and silent. I stepped out of the elevator, my legs trembling. I moved toward the exit, desperate to leave, to escape whatever hell this was. But just as I reached the doors, they didn't open. I pressed my hands against the glass, looking out into the night. But instead of the parking lot, I saw the same hospital corridor staring back at me. The lights flickered in that hallway, just like the one I had just run through. I was trapped, caught in some terrible loop. And then I heard the voice again, my own voice, whispering from behind me, "Get out."